The silence of the cabin was a physical thing, a weight that settled in the hollows of the heart and pressed upon the ears. For Sandra, it was the canvas upon which her world was painted. She knew the geography of their small home not by sight, which had been stolen from her by a fever in her 7th year, but by the subtle symphonies of sound and touch. She could trace the worn grain of the pine table with her fingertips and know its history. The deep score mark where her father's knife had slipped a winter past, the smooth, shallow depression where her own bowl sat for every meal. She knew the groaning complaint of the 3rd floorboard by the hearth, the whisper of the wind as it slipped through a chink in the window frame, and the rhythmic, percussive heartbeat of her father's carving. Samuel's whittling was the cabin's metronome, a steady shaving of wood that spoke of his presence more than his voice ever did. His words were as sparse and weathered as the landscape outside, a vast, unforgiving expanse of rock and timber that clawed at their solitude. Her days were a litany of meticulous routine. She would rise with the first hint of warmth from the embers, her bare feet finding the cold, familiar path across the floor. She would grind the coffee, the rough beans a comfort in her palm, the aroma a small, sharp pleasure in the stillness. They would eat in their customary quiet, the scrape of spoons against tin the only conversation. Afterward, while her father tended to his traps or chopped wood, his sounds receding into the distance, she would tend to the cabin. She swept floors she could not see, her movements a practiced, graceful dance with the space she inhabited. She kneaded bread, her hands knowing the exact moment the dough yielded its tension, becoming smooth and alive beneath her palms. It was a life of profound isolation, a world circumscribed by the 4 walls of the cabin and the limited perimeter she was allowed to walk. Loneliness was a constant companion, a chill that the fire could never quite banish. She yearned for a sound she had never heard, a texture she had never felt, a presence that did not carry the heavy quiet of her father's grief for a wife long dead and a world long lost. Sometimes she would stand at the open door, her face turned toward the forest, and listen, willing the world to offer up a new note, a different rhythm from the one that governed her existence. The wind would only offer the mournful sigh of pine needles, a sound that always felt like a sad and ancient secret. The sun was a warmth on her cheek, a faint pressure that told her it was afternoon. She sat by the hearth, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns on a small, wooden bird her father had carved for her years ago. Its wings were smooth, its head cocked in a permanent attitude of listening. She held it to her ear, imagining its song. Outside, the world was deceptively peaceful. A hawk cried, its call a sharp, lonely tear in the fabric of the sky. But beneath that peace lay a constant, humming tension. The wilderness was a thing of teeth and claws, of sudden, brutal violence. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, was a potential threat. Her father carried that tension in his shoulders, in the grim set of his jaw. He was a man walled in not only by lumber, but by fear. He had built this life to protect her, to keep her safe from a world he deemed too cruel for a blind girl. Yet in his protection, he had built a cage, and the silence was its lock. She lowered the wooden bird, her fingers closing around it tightly. The silence pressed in, heavier than usual, and a profound sense of desolation washed over her. It was the feeling of waiting for a life that had not yet begun. Samuel moved through the woods with a practiced economy of motion, his steps sure on the uneven ground. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell so familiar it was like an extension of his own thoughts. He checked the snares first. 2 rabbits, their bodies already stiffening. He worked quickly, resetting the wires with calloused, competent hands. The forest was a larder, but a fickle one. It gave and it took. He carried the weight of that knowledge every day. It was his duty to stand between its indifference and his daughter. Sandra. The thought of her was a constant, low-grade ache in his chest. He saw not the capable young woman she was, but the small, feverish child crying in the dark, her world stolen away. He had brought her here, to this edge of the world, to shield her from the pity and cruelty of towns, from the dangers that lurked in the hearts of men. But as the years spooled out, he had begun to wonder if he had only traded one kind of prison for another. He saw the stillness in her, the deep, listening quiet, and worried that it was not peace but resignation. He moved on toward the larger traps, the ones meant for bear. The path grew thicker here, the sunlight struggling to pierce the dense canopy. A metallic tang hung in the air, coppery and sharp. It was the scent of blood, and it was fresh. His hand went to the hatchet on his belt, his body tensing. He slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the shadowed undergrowth. Then he heard it, a low groan, a sound of profound and terrible pain. It was not the cry of any animal he knew. It was human. He rounded a thicket of buckthorn and stopped dead. A young man was caught in the steel jaws of the trap, his leg mangled and dark with blood. His skin was the color of rich earth, his black hair matted with sweat and grime. A Comanche. Samuel's mind raced, a torrent of ingrained fear and hard-learned prejudice. A savage. A danger. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to leave the man to his fate. It was the law of the wilderness. You did not invite the wolf into your den. He saw the man's eyes. They were black and filled with a defiant fire that burned through the agony. There was no pleading in them, only a raw, untamed pride that refused to be extinguished. The man's hand was clenched around a stone, his knuckles white. He had been trying to smash the trap's mechanism. Samuel looked at the leg, at the bone that pushed grotesquely against the skin. To leave him would be to sentence him to a slow, horrific death. The wolves or the infection would claim him before the sun set twice. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. His wife, Elspeth, her face pale with her own final fever, her hand clutching his. "Be a good man, Samuel," she had whispered. "Not just a strong one." What was goodness in a world like this? Was it protecting his own, at any cost? Or was it answering the call of a suffering creature, regardless of the risk? He looked from the defiant eyes of the Comanche to the blood-soaked earth, and the choice became brutally simple. He could not walk away. He could not leave a man to die like this. It was a line he would not cross, no matter the consequences. With a heavy sigh that seemed to drain the strength from his limbs, Samuel knelt. He laid his rifle on the ground and began the grim, arduous work of prying open the jaws of the trap. The cabin door opened with a familiar groan, but every sound that followed was alien. Sandra sat bolt upright, her head cocked, her entire being transformed into an instrument of listening. Her father's footsteps were wrong. They were heavier, dragging, punctuated by a second set of sounds, a shuffling, limping gait and the soft, wet tearing of cloth. The air that rushed and was thick with new smells that overwhelmed the familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. It smelled of the forest floor, of sweat, of fear, and most alarmingly, of fresh blood. A low grunt of pain, tightly suppressed, vibrated through the floorboards. Her heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. Her father was not alone. He had brought something or someone from the woods, and it was wounded. "Father." Her voice was a thin thread in the tense air. "Stay seated." "Sandra." Samuel's voice was strained, breathless. It was the voice he used when a threat was near, and it sent a deeper chill through her. She heard him guide the heavy, limping presence across the room. There was a groan as a body was lowered onto the cot in the far corner, the one usually reserved for storing furs. The ropes of the cot creaked in protest under the unexpected weight. A presence. That was the only word for it. It was a weight in the room, a center of gravity that pulled all the silence and tension toward it. It breathed in shallow, ragged gasps. Sandra's hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. Who was it? What had happened? The questions swirled in the darkness of her mind, terrifying and unasked. Her father's movements became a flurry of controlled urgency. She heard the clink of the metal basin, the slosh of water, the tearing of clean linen. The smell of the antiseptic herbs he kept for wounds, sharp and bitter, soon filled the small space, wrestling with the metallic tang of blood. A man. Samuel said finally, his voice low and rough. He was standing by the hearth now, his breathing still heavy. Caught in a bear trap. His leg is bad, man. The word did little to dispel her fear. A stranger in their home was an unprecedented event, a violent disruption of the sanctuary her father had so carefully constructed. Strangers were dangers. Strangers were the reason they lived here at the edge of nowhere. "Who is he?" she whispered. There was a long pause, and in it, Sandra could hear her father's internal struggle. "He's a Comanche," he said at last, the words clipped and hard. The name fell into the room like a stone. Sandra knew the word only from her father's rare, grim stories of the world they had left behind. It was a word spoken with fear and hatred by the people in the towns. An enemy, a savage, and he was here, in their home, breathing their air, lying on their cot. She could feel the stranger's pain as a palpable force in the room, a low, humming vibration of agony that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Fear warred with a nascent, terrifying pity. She tried to picture him, to give a face to the sounds of his suffering, but her mind could conjure only shadows. The cabin, her safe, known world, suddenly felt perilous and frighteningly small, crowded by the presence of this wounded intruder. The silence that fell was no longer empty. It was charged, thick with the unspoken fear of what her father had just dragged across their threshold. The first days were a landscape of hushed sounds and sharp smells. The stranger, the Comanche, was a locus of pain in the corner of the cabin. His fevered breathing became a new, unsettling rhythm in the house, sometimes punctuated by a muffled cry that he seemed to swallow before it could fully form. Sandra learned the cadence of his suffering. Her father was a constant, quiet presence at the man's side, changing dressings, forcing bitter teas between his clenched teeth. Samuel spoke little, his actions doing all the talking. His movements were efficient, but laced with a tension that vibrated through the floorboards. He was a man, tending to a fire he feared might consume them all. Sandra stayed by the hearth, her designated territory, feeling like an intruder in her own home. The space between her and the cot felt like a chasm, a dangerous and uncrossable territory. Yet, she could not stop listening. She learned the sound of his shifting on the cot, the slight hiss of breath when a wave of pain crested. His silence was different from her father's. Samuel's quiet was a wall. This man's silence felt like a deep, still pool, and she could only guess at what lay in its depths. After the fever broke, a new kind of quiet settled. It was an observant silence. The man, her father had not given him a name, was awake and aware. Sandra could feel his gaze on her as she moved about the cabin, a sensation like a subtle change in the air pressure. It wasn't menacing, but it was intense, curious. One afternoon, as she was kneading dough at the table, her father out checking the snares, the man spoke. His voice, when it came, was a surprise. It was low and rough from disuse, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a riverbed. "You move like a willow in the wind," he said. The words were simple, but they struck her with the force of a revelation. No one had ever described her movement. To her father, she was careful, or she was safe. This stranger saw a willow. She stopped her work, her hands still in the dough. "I cannot see," she replied, the admission feeling both like a confession and a defense. She heard a rustle of blankets as he shifted. "I know," he said. "That is why you listen to the floor. It sings to you." His name, she learned, was Toma. He began to speak more as his strength returned, his voice growing smoother, warmer. He did not speak of the trap or of his pain. Instead, he spoke of the world outside, but he painted it in a language she could understand. He did not use colors, words that were just empty sounds to her. He described the vastness of the plains as a silence so big it hums in your bones. The setting sun was not red or orange. It was the feeling of a warm blanket being pulled over the land. He told her of the way a horse's muscles felt under your hand, a coiled power like a drawn bowstring. He spoke of the scent of rain on dry earth, a smell she knew, but he gave a name, the sky's gift to the ground. Sandra, in turn, found herself opening up the world of her own senses. She gave him the wooden bird her father had carved. "Feel the wings," she instructed, her fingers guiding his. They are smooth, like a river stone, but the edges are sharp, like a whisper. She taught him to distinguish the sounds of the forest, the sharp, percussive tap of a woodpecker versus the nervous chatter of a squirrel. They built a bridge between his world of sight and her world of touch and sound. And in doing so, they created a new world, one that belonged only to them in the quiet confines of the cabin. For the first time, Sandra did not feel like a blind girl in a dark room. She felt like a person who simply saw things differently. The cabin's atmosphere began to change, a subtle shift in the emotional climate as profound as the turning of a season. The strict, silent routine that had governed their lives for years began to bend, to soften. Toma, his leg healing, his movements growing more confident, was no longer just a patient. He was a presence that filled the spaces between the silences. He would help Sandra shell beans, his larger hands clumsy at first, a quiet chuckle rumbling in his chest when a bean escaped his grasp. He would sit by the fire while she spun wool, listening to the hum of the wheel, and he would tell her stories of his people, tales of trickster coyotes and the star-scattered trail of the spirits. His voice became a new kind of warmth in the cabin, a steady flame that pushed back the ever-present chill of loneliness. Sandra found a lightness blooming in her chest, an unfamiliar sensation. A smile would touch her lips without her conscious thought when she heard his steady breathing nearby, or the soft pad of his moccasined foot on the floor. She began to anticipate his words, to wait for the unique way he saw the world and translated it for her. Samuel observed this transformation from a distance. His silence now weighted with a complex mixture of emotions. He stood in the doorway, his axe in his hand, watching Toma show Sandra how to feel the difference between a hawk's feather and an owl's. One smooth for speed, the other soft edge for silent flight. He saw the genuine, unguarded smile on his daughter's face, a sight so rare it was like a glimpse of the sun after a long, gray winter. A part of him, the father who wanted only her happiness, felt a deep sense of relief. The stony resignation he had seen in her for years was melting away, replaced by a vibrant curiosity and engagement with the world. He could not deny the good that Toma's presence had brought. The cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a home. But the other part of him, the protector, the man who had fled the world for this very reason, was terrified. This connection, this burgeoning tenderness, was a fragile thing in a brutal world. Toma was a Comanche. To the world outside their secluded valley, he was not a man, but a threat, a bounty, a reason for violence. His fear manifested as a gruff, protective watchfulness. He would interrupt their quiet conversations with a loud clearing of his throat or a sudden, noisy task like splitting kindling just outside the door. He never spoke his fears aloud, but they were there in the hard set of his jaw as he watched them, in the way his eyes would narrow when he heard Sandra laugh. One evening, as Sandra and Toma sat near the fire, their heads close together as he described the patterns of the stars, Samuel spoke, his voice sharp enough to cut the warm air. "The wind is turning," he said, looking not at the sky, but directly at Toma. "Storm's coming. Best to be ready for it." It was a clear warning, a reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Toma met his gaze, his expression unreadable, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The message was received. Later that night, as Sandra lay in her bunk, she heard her father's carving knife working with a frantic, angry energy. Each slice of the wood was a sharp, percussive expression of his worry, a sound that spoke of love and fear so deeply intertwined they had become the same thing. The tender space that had grown between her and Toma now felt charged, fragile, and shadowed by the inevitable storm her father had predicted. The knock on the door was a violation. It was a sound so foreign, so aggressive in the deep quiet of their lives, that it seemed to strike the very logs of the cabin and make them shudder. Sandra froze, a half-peeled potato in her hand, her knuckles bloodless. Her father, who had been oiling his rifle by the fire, went instantly rigid. His head snapped up, his body a study in coiled, dangerous stillness. His eyes, she knew without seeing, would be flinty and hard. He looked at Toma, who was sitting on his cot, mending a tear in his moccasin. Samuel made a single, sharp gesture with his hand, a downward slash that meant hide. The urgency was absolute. Sandra's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, suffocating silence. She heard the whisper of cloth and the soft scrape of the loose floorboard beneath the cot. A faint scent of dust and dry earth rose as Toma slipped into the shallow space below, pulling the fur pelts over the opening. It was a desperate, flimsy concealment. Samuel took a deep, steadying breath, the sound unnaturally loud in the small room. He moved to the door, his steps heavy, deliberate. He was placing his body, his will, between his home and the world. Sandra remained at the table, forcing herself into a posture of calm. She set the potato down, folded her hands in her lap, and composed her face into the placid, sightless mask she knew how to wear. She had to be nothing more than a blind girl in a cabin, an object unremarkable. The bolt slid back with a grating shriek of protest. The door opened. "Samuel," a voice said. It was smooth, with a false, oily hardiness that slid over the skin like something unclean. Been a while, Sandra focused all her being on that voice. It was a predator's voice, confident and hungry. "Sheriff," her father replied, his tone flat and unwelcoming. "Barlow, what brings you this far out?" "Official business," the sheriff said. Sandra heard the creak of leather as he shifted his weight, the jingle of spurs. He was on their porch, his presence a dark stain on their sanctuary. "We're huntin'. Got word a Comanche buck jumped the reservation. Killed a man down near Dusty Creek. He was wounded, they say. See anyone like that passing through?" The lie was as palpable as the smell of the man's sweat. The story was too neat, too convenient. This wasn't about justice. It was about something else. Greed. A bounty. "Just me and my girl," Samuel said, his voice a wall of stone. "We don't get visitors," Barlow chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Mind if I come in for a drink of water?" "It's a dry ride." He didn't wait for an answer. Sandra heard his heavy boots cross the threshold. The air immediately felt thicker, contaminated. His gaze swept the room. She could feel it, a physical touch that crawled over the walls, the table, lingering on the 2 plates from their midday meal, on the cot with its slightly disturbed furs on her. "Your girl's grown," Barlow commented, his voice dropping into a tone of feigned sympathy that made her stomach clench. "Still the same." The unspoken word was blind. "Useless." "She's fine," Samuel growled. Sandra sat perfectly still, listening to the man's breathing, to the way he moved, his senses on high alert. Beneath the floorboards, there was only absolute silence. Toma was a part of the earth, waiting. The tension was a high, thin wire stretching to its breaking point. The moment Sheriff Barlow's horse was out of earshot, the atmosphere inside the cabin imploded. The false calm shattered, and the silence that rushed in to replace it was jagged with fear and fury. Samuel slammed the bolt on the door with such force that Sandra flinched. He began to pace, his heavy boots striking the floorboards in a caged, frantic rhythm. The space, which had felt so small with the sheriff inside it, now felt dangerously claustrophobic with her father's rage. He was a storm contained within 4 walls. Sandra heard the muffled scrape as Toma emerged from his hiding place, dust motes dancing in the slivers of light she could not see. He stood, a silent, grim figure, knowing he was the epicenter of this tempest. "He knows," Samuel bit out, his voice a low, ragged snarl. He smelled it. The herbs. He saw the plates. He was lying about the killing. "It's a bounty hunt. That's all." He finally stopped pacing and turned, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "You have to leave," he said, the words aimed directly at Toma. "Tonight, as soon as it's dark. Your leg is strong enough to walk. It's not strong enough to run, but you have to go." It was not a request. It was a command, born of sheer, primal terror for his daughter's safety. Sandra felt a cold dread wash over her, followed by a surge of something hot and fierce. For years, she had been a passive observer in her own life, a silent recipient of her father's decisions. But the past weeks had changed her. Toma's presence had awakened a part of her she hadn't known existed, a core of strength that had been dormant for too long. She would not let him be sent out into the night, injured and alone, to be hunted down like an animal. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor to sound a sharp crack of defiance. "No," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was clear and steady, and it hung in the air between them, shocking them both with its firmness. Her father turned on her, his anger momentarily replaced by disbelief. "Sandra, you don't understand. I understand perfectly," she cut him off, taking a step toward the sound of his voice. "I heard that man's voice. I smelled the greed on him. You are right, father, he is a danger. But Toma is not. Sending him out there is the same as handing him over to Barlow. It is a death sentence, and I will not be a part of it." Samuel was speechless. He had never been challenged like this, certainly not by her. He saw not his helpless child, but a resolute woman standing before him, her sightless eyes seeming to look right through him. "This is my home," he sputtered, his authority crumbling. "My decision, it is my home, too," she countered, her voice ringing with newfound conviction. "And he is our guest. We do not throw our guest to the wolves." The argument was a fissure running through the foundation of their relationship. It was the first time she had not only disagreed with him, but had openly defied his will, claiming her own moral authority. Toma, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "She's right. Barlow will not be far, but I will not be the cause of a war in this house. You will stay," Sandra commanded, turning her head toward him. "We face this here. Together." The final word hung in the air. The line had been drawn, not in the dirt outside, but on the floor of the cabin itself. A tense, unbreaded stalemate settled over them, heavy with the weight of the choice that lay ahead. The sky began to curdle. What had been a clear, cold blue just hours ago was now bruised with shades of slate gray and a sickly, yellow-green light that signaled a storm of unusual violence. The wind picked up, a low moan at first, then a rising shriek that clawed at the corners of the cabin and rattled the window panes. It was as if the world outside was mirroring the turbulent tempest within their walls. Since Sandra's defiance, a heavy, charged silence had fallen, broken only by the howl of the wind and the nervous crackle of the fire. Her father sat in his chair, the unfinished rifle stock lying across his knees, his hands still. He was staring into the flames, lost in a conflict she could feel but not see. He was a man caught between two fears: the fear of the outside world he had always known, and the new, shocking fear of failing the woman his daughter had become. His rigid certainty had been fractured, and in its place was a terrible, churning doubt. Thomas sat on the edge of his cot, his posture radiating a quiet tension. He was sharpening a small knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shhk of steel on stone a counterpoint to the rising wind. The sound was methodical, preparatory. He was readying himself for a fight he had not sought, a fight brought to their door by one man's compassion and another's greed. He had offered to leave, to draw the danger away from them, but Sandra's resolute stand had bound him here. He would not dishonor her choice by showing fear or by running. He would meet what was coming. Sandra stood by the window, her hand resting on the cool glass, feeling the vibrations of the wind. She could smell the ozone in the air, the electric scent of the approaching storm. The world was holding its breath. She was no longer afraid. The terror she had felt during Barlow's visit had been burned away, cauterized by the heat of her own resolve. A strange, calm clarity had settled over her. They had made their choice, or rather, she had made it for them, and all that was left was to face the consequences. "He is a good man, father," she said softly, not turning from the window. Her voice was not argumentative, but a simple statement of fact. "He sees the world in a way I never knew." "He gave me a gift." Samuel didn't respond, but she heard him shift in his chair, a sign that he was listening. "That man," she continued, Sheriff Barlow, "he looks at me and sees a broken thing, something to be pitted or ignored. Toma looks at me and sees a willow. He sees a person. The first distant rumble of thunder echoed through the valley, a low growl from the belly of the storm. It was a warning. And then another sound, closer, sharper, cutting through the wind's cry. The distinct, rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on gravel and pine needles. The jingle of a saddle harness. It was not one man. It was several. They were back. Samuel shot to his feet, grabbing the rifle. The time for doubt was over. He moved to the door, his body now a solid, unmoving bastion of defiance. Toma rose, slipping the newly sharpened knife into his belt. He stood a few feet behind Samuel, unarmed but for that small blade. Yet his presence was a solid declaration. They were coming. The storm was here. Barlow did not bother with the pretense of a knock this time. His voice, amplified by the wind, cut through the door. "Samuel, we know you're in there, and we know who you're hiding. Send the Comanche out now, and we'll forget we ever saw you." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Two other voices, rough and indistinct, echoed his call. Samuel stood his ground, his knuckles white on the rifle. "He's not here," he yelled back, his voice a roar against the wind. "You're on my land. Get off it. Don't be a fool, old man." Barlow's voice was closer now, right at the door. "We tracked him. Don't make us burn you out." The threat hung in the air, acrid and real. Inside, Sandra moved. A plan, desperate and born of a deep understanding of men like Barlow, formed in her mind. She walked past her father, her hand brushing his arm in a silent message. He tensed, ready to stop her, but she did not pause. She reached for the bolt. "Sandra, no," he hissed, but she was already pulling it back. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch into the teeth of the gale. The wind tore at her hair, plastering her simple dress to her frame. Rain, cold and sharp, began to fall. Barlow and two grim-faced men stood there, their hands on their holstered pistols, their expressions a mixture of surprise and impatience at the sight of her. For a moment, her sudden appearance disarmed them. They saw what they expected to see, a frail, blind girl caught in a storm. "There is no one here but my father and me," she said, her voice impossibly clear and strong above the wind's howl. She held her head high, her sightless eyes fixed in their direction. She used their perception of her, their dismissal of her, as a shield. Barlow sneered, recovering himself. "Get out of the way, girl." He took a step forward, intending to push past her. In that instant, everything happened at once. Samuel raised the rifle, the barrel leveling directly at Barlow's chest. "Touch her, and you die," he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. Simultaneously, Thomas stepped through the doorway. He did not lunge or shout. He simply appeared, moving to stand at Sandra's side, slightly behind her. He was unarmed, his hands open at his sides, but his presence was an unshakable challenge. He stood tall, his gaze locking with Barlow's, a silent testament of defiance. The tableau on the porch held for a heart-stopping second. The old man with the rifle, the blind girl who would not yield, and the wounded Comanche who stood with them, united and absolute. Barlow and his men looked at the three of them, this small, unlikely fortress of resistance. They saw the cold certainty in Samuel's eyes, the fierce, unshakable strength in Sandra's stance, and the proud defiance of the man they had come to claim. Barlow's eyes darted between them. This was not the easy bounty he had imagined. This would be bloody. It would be difficult. And looking at the strange, fierce family before him, he seemed to decide it was not worth the price. With a frustrated curse that was snatched away by the wind, he spat on the ground. "To hell with it," he snarled. "He ain't worth dying for." He backed away, gesturing for his men to follow. They retreated into the growing gloom, their figures dissolving into the rain and the shadows, vanquished not by force of arms alone, but by a conviction they could not comprehend and did not dare to test. As the sound of Barlow's retreating men faded into the roar of the wind, the sky opened completely. A torrential downpour descended, a great, cleansing wave that washed over the porch, soaking the three of them to the bone in seconds. The world was a churning chaos of wind and water. They stood there for a long moment, unmoving, letting the rain sluice away the tension, the fear, the acrid taste of the confrontation. Then, Samuel lowered the rifle, the rigid lines of his body finally softening. He reached out, his hand finding Sandra's shoulder, a gesture of profound, unspoken emotion. Toma moved to her other side, his presence a warm, solid anchor in the storm. Together, they turned and retreated into the dry sanctuary of the cabin, closing the door on the wildness outside. The fire hissed and popped, casting a warm, dancing light on their dripping forms. The external threat had passed, and in its wake, the internal conflicts had been washed clean. Samuel leaned a rifle against the wall and looked at his daughter. He was not looking at the fragile child he had sought to protect from the world, but the formidable woman who had just faced that world down and won. He saw the strength in her that he had mistaken for resignation, the courage he had failed to recognize. A lifetime of overprotective fear dissolved in that single, silent gaze, replaced by a deep, aching respect. His eyes then moved to Toma, who was watching Sandra with an expression of quiet awe. Samuel gave a short, sharp nod. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a treaty, an acceptance, an apology, an invitation. The silence that filled the cabin now was not the empty, lonely quiet of their past. It was a shared stillness, rich with unspoken understanding and forged in the heat of a shared trial. It was the comfortable silence of belonging. Sandra felt the shift in the room, the realignment of their small universe. The fear was gone, leaving behind a foundation that felt solid and true. She reached out, her senses guiding her. One hand found the rough, warm wool of her father's sleeve. Her other hand found Toma's, his fingers closing around hers, strong and sure. They stood there in a loose, silent triangle before the hearth, the storm raging a world away, its fury a mere echo against the peace they had won. The wooden bird Toma had once described as having wings like whispers sat on the mantel, a silent witness. Her father had built this cabin to be a shelter from the world. But a home was not just walls and a roof. She understood that now. A home was a place where you were seen, a place where you were willing to stand and fight, not just for yourself, but for the people who shared your fire. The future was a vast, unknown territory, as uncertain as the weather. But for the first time in her life, Sandra did not feel alone in facing it. The storm would pass, the sun would rise, and they would be here together, a quiet, resilient hope, more potent than any fear,